Mark Jennings had always found peace in the grease, the hum of engines, and the clinking of tools in his small auto repair shop. The simple rhythm of fixing cars had been his world for as long as he could remember. But today, something felt different, as if the air itself was thick with anticipation. As he bent over the hood of an old sedan, the door chimed, signaling a customer, but it wasn't the usual beat-up car pulling in. Instead, Sarah, a frantic woman with a look of urgency, appeared at the threshold, pushing her daughter, Emma, in a wheelchair that seemed more broken than functional. Mark squinted, noticing the wheelchair's worn-out condition. The wheels were uneven, barely able to hold the child up. Emma, with her big brown eyes full of hope and innocence, sat still, looking at him with an expression that felt almost too heavy for her tender age. "Please, can you help us?" the woman pleaded, her voice trembling. "My daughter's wheelchair broke and we can't afford to get it fixed. She can't even move anymore." Mark's heart dropped as he saw the raw desperation in Sarah's eyes. He had seen it before, that look of helplessness when people walked into his shop, people who couldn't afford repairs but had no choice but to ask for help. Mark had always believed in paying it forward, doing what he could when the world felt unforgiving. "Don't worry about the money," he said firmly, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable sense of urgency in his words. "I'll fix it for you, no charge." He knelt beside the wheelchair and examined it. As he worked on the broken wheels, he could feel a sense of responsibility pressing against his chest. This wasn't just a mechanical job. This was a lifeline for this child, for this mother who was barely holding it together. Mark knew that the simple act of fixing this chair could mean the difference between Emma's freedom and being trapped in a chair that would leave her stuck, dependent, and helpless. Sarah stood nearby, watching him closely, her hands wringing together as she anxiously awaited the outcome. She kept glancing at her daughter, whispering quiet words of reassurance that Mark could barely hear over the sound of his tools. Mark could sense the weight of the situation. Sarah wasn't just concerned about her daughter's wheelchair. She was worried about the future, about the unspoken fear that their lives would never be the same without it. "I don't know what to say," Sarah finally spoke, her voice breaking. "We've been trying to save up for weeks, but with everything else, it's just so hard. I can't even take her to school anymore. I'm afraid we're running out of time." Mark paused for a moment, glancing up at her. He saw the deep concern in her eyes, the kind of concern that only a mother could truly understand. Mark had been raised by a single mother, and he knew all too well the sacrifices parents made for their children. This wasn't just about a broken wheelchair. This was about survival, about giving her daughter the chance to experience life beyond the limitations she faced. "I've got it," Mark said, his voice steady as he tightened the final bolt on the wheelchair. "She'll be good to go. I'll make sure of it." When Mark finished, he stepped back and motioned for Sarah to come closer. He could see the relief flood her face as she rolled the wheelchair toward Emma. The little girl's eyes lit up as she was lifted into the chair, and for the first time that evening, Sarah let out a soft, grateful sigh. "You did it," Sarah whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I can't thank you enough." Mark smiled, wiping his hands on his rag, trying to hide the swelling emotion inside. "It's nothing. Just take care of her." But as Sarah wheeled Emma toward the door, something unexpected happened. She turned back to him, a look of uncertainty in her eyes. "Mark, there's something you should know." Before she could say more, the door creaked open again, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A man dressed in a sleek black suit, his face sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. He was an enigma. Sarah stiffened. The stranger had a presence, a weight to him that Mark couldn't ignore. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man said, his voice smooth but laced with authority. "But you're Mark Jennings, the mechanic, correct?" Mark stood up, confused. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" The man walked closer, his eyes briefly scanning the repair shop, then fixing on Mark. "My name is Ethan Caldwell. I represent a very influential client. There's been a development regarding your recent act of kindness. Mark blinked, his confusion deepening. I don't understand. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Mark felt an uncomfortable tension build between them, the air thick with uncertainty. You'll understand soon enough, Ethan replied cryptically. You've done something remarkable, and my client wants to reward you for it. Mark's head spun. A reward for fixing a wheelchair? Who was this man? And why would anyone want to reward him for something so small? Before Mark could speak, Ethan continued. We're offering you a chance, an opportunity that will change your life. Mark's mind raced. What was this about? Was this some sort of scam or worse, some elaborate trap? Ethan could see Mark's hesitation, and without missing a beat, he added, My client will explain everything, but you need to trust me. You won't have to work another day in your life. A jet is waiting for you. You'll be flown to the location where you'll meet my client. He wants to meet you personally. Mark's head spun. A private jet? Who was this man? And why would anyone want to meet him? Someone who was just an ordinary mechanic. Why? Mark asked, still in disbelief. Why would anyone care about something like that? Ethan smiled slightly, his eyes gleaming. You'll understand soon enough. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark's mind was filled with confusion and excitement, but mostly disbelief. A private jet? A billionaire? It was too surreal. But as he stood on the tarmac of a private airport, watching the sleek aircraft glide to a stop, all his doubts faded away. This was real. It was happening. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, what kind of world he was stepping into, but he couldn't deny the curiosity gnawing at him. He had gone from fixing broken cars to meeting someone who could change his life forever. He boarded the jet. A mix of emotions washed over him: anxiety, wonder, and excitement. The doors closed behind him, and the jet began to taxi down the runway, lifting off into the sky, away from everything Mark had ever known. When Mark stepped off the jet, he was led into a grand mansion, a world far removed from his modest auto shop. Ethan led him through marble corridors, past towering windows that overlooked lush gardens. Finally, they arrived at a study where a man in his 50s stood, his expression calm but intense. He was taller than Mark expected, with graying hair and a sharp suit that seemed to scream wealth. Mark Jennings, the man said, his voice deep and measured. I'm Robert Caldwell. You may not understand yet, but you've just changed your life. Mark blinked, still trying to process what was happening. I'm not sure I understand. What's going on? Robert smiled, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Let me explain. You see, what you did for that little girl, it didn't just touch her heart. It touched the heart of someone else too. Someone who has the power to change the lives of people like you. Mark's stomach tightened. The truth was sinking in. This was no ordinary meeting. This wasn't just a thank you for fixing a wheelchair. This was something bigger, something that could rewrite his life's story in ways he hadn't even begun to imagine. Mark Jennings had always found peace in the hum of engines, the scent of motor oil, and the sound of tools clinking against metal. His auto repair shop was modest, but was his sanctuary. Yet today, as he worked on a car in the corner of his workshop, the usual rhythm was disrupted. The door chimed, signaling a customer. But it wasn't a car, it was a wheelchair. Sarah, a woman with a frantic look in her eyes, pushed her daughter Emma inside. Emma's wheelchair was in disrepair, the wheels crooked, the seat barely holding together. Sarah's face reflected an urgency that Mark could immediately recognize, the worry of a mother with no other options. He knew something had to be done. Please, can you help us? Sarah asked, voice shaking with a desperation that made Mark pause. She can't move anymore, the wheelchair's broken, and we can't afford the repairs. Mark's heart clenched. He looked at Emma, her wide, innocent brown eyes staring back at him. She wasn't complaining or even asking for help. She simply sat there, still, like a child who had long learned to accept her limitations. In her eyes, Mark saw only trust. She didn't know the weight of the world or the financial struggles her mother faced. She simply single mother, and he understood the emotional weight of such a struggle. He nodded in understanding, and without another word, he set to work. When he finished, he stepped back and gestured for Sarah to try. Mark stood frozen, trying to process the situation. "I'm not sure I understand." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, and the tension in the room grew. "You will," he said. "But first I need you to come with me. My client wants to meet you. There's an opportunity in this for you. Something that will change your life." Mark's mind raced. What opportunity? Who would be interested in him? A simple mechanic fixing a broken wheelchair. Was this some sort of scam? Before Mark could respond, Ethan continued. "A private jet is waiting for you. My client has already made arrangements. Trust me, this will change everything for you." In the following days, Mark barely had time to process the whirlwind of events. A private jet? Who was this mysterious client? Was this some elaborate joke? But as he boarded the sleek jet, a mix of excitement and anxiety washed over him. What was waiting for him at the other end of this flight? The jet soared through the sky, and Mark, for the first time in his life, felt like something monumental was about to unfold. When the jet finally landed, he was taken to a mansion, a stark contrast to his humble auto shop. There, he met Robert Caldwell, the billionaire whose life he had unknowingly changed. "I've heard about you, Mark," Robert said, his voice calm yet intense. "You don't know it yet, but you've done something extraordinary." Mark stood in awe, still trying to understand what was going on. "I just fixed a wheelchair. Why is that so special?" Robert's eyes gleamed with a quiet amusement. "It's not just a wheelchair, Mark. It's what you did for that little girl. And what you did for her matters more than you realize." For the first time, Mark felt the enormity of what he had done. It wasn't just about fixing a broken chair, it was about offering hope when everything seemed hopeless. It was about showing kindness when the world had become indifferent. And as he stood there in that grand mansion, Mark realized that this was only the beginning. What started as a small act of kindness would ripple out and change his life forever. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he made the final adjustment to the wheelchair. Sarah stood off to the side, her eyes glued to the scene before her, a mixture of hope and fear in her gaze. Emma, seated in the wheelchair, was quiet, her small hands clutching the sides. She didn't ask for much, never complained. Yet in her silence there was a weight, one that only a mother could truly understand. The air in the shop was thick with anticipation, but there was a stillness too, as if the world outside had paused for a moment. Mark stood up, wiping his brow, and took a step back, giving Sarah a hesitant glance. She met his eyes, her voice, barely a whisper. Can she try it?" Her words trembled as if asking for permission to hope. "Of course," Mark replied softly. trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah bent down gently and adjusted Emma's position in the chair, her hands brushing the girl's hair back tenderly. For a moment, Sarah's face was filled with such profound love and sorrow that it hurt Mark to look at it. He could see the years of struggle in her eyes, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the constant battle to provide for Emma's needs, pure and unfiltered, and Mark couldn't help but feel his heart clench at the sight. It was a moment of innocent joy, a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah stood up, her hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. Mark could see how much it meant to her. This simple act of kindness had given her more than just a repaired wheelchair. It had given her a glimmer of hope, a fleeting moment where things didn't feel so impossible. The weight of her exhaustion, her fears for Emma's future seemed to lift, if only for a moment. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, the words heavy with gratitude. Her voice cracked, and she quickly took Mark's breath away. "I can go to the park now. I can play." The innocence in Emma's words pierced Mark's heart. He wasn't just fixing a chair. He was giving a child the chance to live, to play, to experience the world as every child should. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in his throat. "Anytime," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure who he was reassuring, Sarah, Emma, or himself. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. All that mattered was that Emma was smiling again, and Sarah could breathe a little easier. Mark watched as Sarah and Emma left the shop, the sound of the wheels on the concrete floor fading away. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he had done something truly meaningful, something that mattered. As the door closed behind them, he stood there for a long time, lost in the moment, feeling the weight of his own emotions. Mark had spent the following days reflecting on that small act of kindness. Every time he thought back to Emma's smile, his chest swelled with a feeling he hadn't known in years: contentment. He had done something good, something meaningful, and for once he felt a sense of peace. But as the days passed, something strange began to unfold. It was just another ordinary Tuesday when Mark got a call that would change everything. The phone rang as Mark was finishing up his lunch in the workshop. Wiping his hands on a rag, he answered, expecting it to be another customer. But the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Is this Mark Jennings?" The voice was calm, yet there was something unsettling about it. "This is Ethan Caldwell. I represent Robert Caldwell. We need to talk." Mark's stomach dropped. Robert Caldwell? The name echoed in his mind, but he couldn't place it. The name sounded like it belonged to someone important, but in his world, he never paid much attention to such things. "Who's Robert Caldwell?" Mark asked cautiously, his fingers tightening around the phone. There was a pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice almost too calm. "Let's just say he's someone who's very interested in you and your recent act of kindness. I think it's time we met." Mark's heart raced. What was this about? Was this some sort of prank? But the calm authority in Ethan's voice made it clear this was no joke. "I don't understand," Mark replied, confusion lacing his voice. "What does this have to do with me fixing a wheelchair?" "You'll see," Ethan said. "A private jet is waiting for you. My client would like to meet you." Mark's mind was reeling. A private jet? This had to be some sort of mistake. But the idea of meeting someone important, was enough to spark his curiosity. He hadn't even packed, and yet Ethan was already sending a car to pick him up. Before he could even question the decision further, the car arrived, and Mark, feeling like a deer in headlights, reluctantly climbed in. The journey felt surreal. Mark had never been on a plane before, let alone a private jet. As the jet soared through the sky, his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Who was Robert Caldwell? Why would a billionaire want to meet him? Was this some kind of offer, a reward for fixing Emma's wheelchair? When the jet landed, Mark was ushered into a sleek black limousine that drove him to a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. The building was nothing short of extravagant. Surrounded by lush gardens, a fountain in the center of the courtyard, and towering marble pillars that gave it the air of something out of a movie. Mark was led inside by Ethan, who was now a ghostly figure leading him through the opulent halls. Finally, they stopped in front of a large wooden door. "Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you," Ethan said, gesturing for Mark to step forward. Mark took a deep breath and pushed open the door, unsure of what he would find on the other side. Inside, sitting at an enormous oak desk, was a man who looked every bit the part of a billionaire. Robert Caldwell. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his face stoic and his eyes cold but calculating. He looked up as Mark entered, his lips curling into a slight smile. "Ah, Mark Jennings," Robert greeted, his voice smooth but laced with something Mark couldn't quite identify. "I've been expecting you." "Look, I'm not sure I understand what's going on here," Mark said, his voice wavering slightly. "I fixed a wheelchair? And now I'm here? What does this have to do with me?" Robert leaned forward, his fingers steepled together, his gaze unwavering. "You've done something extraordinary, Mark, and now I need you to understand the opportunity before you." Mark frowned. "Opportunity? I'm just a mechanic. I don't know what kind of opportunity you think I'm qualified for." Robert's smile widened. "You're more than just a mechanic, Mark. You're a man who has proven that he understands the value of kindness. And that, my friend, is worth more than you realize. My client has taken notice." Mark's confusion only deepened. "What are you talking about? Who's your client?" "That," Robert said, "is something you'll need to find out for yourself." Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. He had expected answers, but instead he was being led down a path of even more questions. Robert stood up from his desk and walked toward a window that looked out over the estate. "Do you know who my client is, Mark?" Robert asked without turning to face him. Mark shook his head. "No, I don't." "The person who you helped." "Emma," Robert said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "She's my daughter." Mark's heart stopped. "What? Emma is your daughter?" "Yes," Robert said, his eyes now cold and distant. "You didn't fix a broken wheelchair, Mark. You helped restore my daughter's independence. And in doing so, you've become a part of something much bigger than you realize. You've become an asset." Mark stood frozen, the gravity of Robert's words sinking in. This was no ordinary act of kindness. He had no idea that Emma, the sweet child he had helped, was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the world. Robert Caldwell had been watching him, studying him all along. "I don't understand," Mark whispered, his mind racing. "What does this mean for me?" Robert turned to face him, his gaze now calculating. "It means that I've seen your character, Mark. I've seen what you're capable of, and I want you to come work for me. Help me run my businesses. Your life as a mechanic is over." Mark felt a rush of emotions: confusion, disbelief, excitement, and fear, all mingling inside him. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn. One moment he was fixing a wheelchair for a little girl, and the next, he was being offered a life he could never have dreamed of. But as Mark stood there in that opulent mansion, he realized that this was no longer just about fixing things. It was about the choices he made, the kindness he had shown, and how the ripples of that kindness had come back to him in ways he never expected. Mark's life had always been simple. He had no grand ambitions, no desires for wealth or recognition. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, found their purpose in fixing things: machines, cars, and now a wheelchair for a little girl named Emma. He was used to being overlooked, to working quietly in the background without anyone noticing. He didn't seek accolades or rewards, but this time, something was different. As Mark continued his work, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the surveillance cameras at his shop or the constant flow of customers that kept him on edge. It was something more, something intangible. Yet he kept it to himself. It wasn't in his nature to draw attention to himself. He didn't need recognition, nor did he want it. But that didn't stop the weight of the world from pressing on him as he realized what he had given up. Every evening after the repairs were done, he'd find himself working late, lost in his thoughts as he stayed up, tinkering with small projects, and filling the silence that seemed to swallow him. His small mechanic shop was the only place where he truly felt in control, but even there, the pressure was mounting. Bills, repairs, personal sacrifices, they were all quietly stacking up, with no one noticing. It was a silent sacrifice that no one would ever know about. Mark had always put others first. His work was his way of giving back, not just for the sake of the customers, but for the people he loved, especially Emma and her mother, Sarah. He never asked for anything in return, even though it often meant sacrificing his own time, his own needs, and even his own happiness. His shop, though modest, was a reflection of his life, a place filled with tools and machines, all meant to fix things for others, even if it meant that Mark himself was slowly falling apart. He hadn't told Sarah the full story, nor had he shared it with anyone else. That he often skipped meals just to make sure he could get one more part for Emma's wheelchair. That he worked late nights not because he had the energy to do so, but because he had no choice. That when the bills came, he had to prioritize which one to pay, always making sure that the repairs for Emma's wheelchair were at the top of the list. Even if it meant putting off repairs his life forever. Felt like a betrayal of everything Mark stood for. He had always been the one who fixed things for others, never asking for anything in return. And now he was being offered a life he had never dreamed of. A life that felt like a reward for a kindness he didn't think was worthy of such a grand gesture. The silence of his sacrifices weighed heavily on him. He had never allowed himself the luxury of dreams, of thinking beyond his small shop and simple life. But now, as Robert Caldwell handed him a golden opportunity, Mark couldn't help but feel the burden of everything he had quietly given up for the sake of others. It was a silent sacrifice, one that no one would ever know about, but one that had shaped him into the man standing before Robert Caldwell today. In the quiet of the mansion, as Robert made his pitch, Mark couldn't ignore the aching emptiness in his chest. He had always known that there was more to life than just fixing things, but he had never allowed himself to take that first step toward something bigger. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own peace of mind, for the sake of others. And now he was faced with the consequences of that sacrifice. The promise of a life that he hadn't asked for, yet one that would pull him away from everything he had ever known. As he sat there, listening to Robert's words, Mark's thoughts turned to Emma and Sarah. He thought about how they had trusted him to fix the wheelchair, how their lives had become intertwined with his in a way he never expected. He had given so much silently, without any expectation of recognition, but now he was being pulled in a direction that felt uncertain, unfamiliar. The silent sacrifices he had made over the years were starting to weigh on him, and in that moment, he realized something. He had been afraid of taking the next step, afraid of the consequences of choosing himself over others. But perhaps it was time to stop sacrificing his own happiness for the sake of others. Maybe, just maybe, he had earned the right to choose a new path for himself, one where he could still help others, but also live a life that was his own. Mark's hands trembled as he sat in the lavish mansion, the golden opportunity Robert Caldwell had just offered him hanging in the air like a weight on his chest. The room, filled with opulence and luxury, felt foreign to him, like he didn't belong. Despite the grandeur, the only thing that consumed his mind was Emma, the young girl whose wheelchair he had fixed, and Sarah, her mother, whose life was so intertwined with his. His mind raced as Robert continued speaking, outlining the high-paying position he was offering. But Mark wasn't listening. His thoughts were consumed by the sacrifice he had made for Emma and the silent promise he had sworn to her mother. He had always protected them both, in the small ways that he could. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was their protector, their lifeline. He had promised Emma that no matter how hard it got, no matter what life threw at him, he would never leave her side. The offer in front of him felt like a dream, but it also felt like a betrayal. He couldn't abandon the people who had come to rely on him. He couldn't leave behind the small yet meaningful world that had given him purpose. Not for fame, not for money, not for anything. The thought of walking away from his role as a protector, from the small acts of kindness that had become his reason for waking up every day, was suffocating. It was a choice he wasn't sure he could make. The mansion, despite its beauty, only felt colder with each passing moment. Mark's determination began to burn brighter. He was a man who valued loyalty above all else. The idea of leaving Emma and Sarah behind for an unknown future was inconceivable. He had worked tirelessly to help them, to fix what was broken in their lives. How could he walk away from them now? Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. Robert Caldwell raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden movement. But Mark didn't care. The protective instinct that had guided him for so long surged through his veins, and he was no longer just sitting in front of a billionaire with an offer. He was a man determined to honor his word, his promise to the people who mattered most. "I can't accept this," Mark said firmly, his voice strong, despite the turmoil inside him. Robert blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, his voice now tinged with curiosity. "I've worked hard all my life to get by," Mark replied, his eyes locking onto Robert's, unwavering. "But I've also made promises. Promises to people who depend on me. Emma and her mother, Sarah, they need me. They need me more than anything else in the world. I can't leave them behind for something like this." There was a moment of silence as Robert regarded him, and Mark could see the wheels turning in his head. Robert, ever the businessman, was calculating, assessing. He didn't expect Mark to turn down such an opportunity. It was the kind of offer most people would jump at. But to Mark, this wasn't about money or status. This was about the quiet, invisible bond he had with Emma and Sarah, the bond that had kept him going through the darkest of days. "I understand your loyalty," Robert said after a moment, his voice softer now. "But I think you're not seeing the bigger picture. This could change your life. It could change theirs too." Mark shook his head. "Maybe. But I can't sacrifice what matters most to me. I'm not some businessman chasing the next big thing. I'm a mechanic, and I know what it means to fix things. But fixing things doesn't mean leaving people behind." The air between them felt thick with tension, but Mark remained firm in his decision. His hands, once shaking with doubt, were now steady with resolve. He had made his choice, and no amount of wealth or influence could sway him from it. "I can't abandon them," he repeated, his voice softer now but still filled with the same protective determination. "I will not abandon the people who have trusted me. I can't do that, not for anything." For a brief moment, Robert Caldwell studied him, perhaps seeing something in Mark that he hadn't anticipated. Something stronger than the lure of money. Something that couldn't be bought. Mark had chosen to stay true to his values. He had chosen to protect the people who had become his family, to continue fixing what was broken in their lives, no matter the cost to his own. It wasn't the easiest choice, but it was the right one. As Mark turned to leave the room, his heart pounding in his chest, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He wasn't walking away from opportunity. He was walking towards something even greater, the chance to continue being the protector, the steady presence that Emma and Sarah needed. They would always be his priority, and no amount of wealth or status could change that. It was this protective determination, this unwavering loyalty to the people he loved, that defined him. Mark didn't need the riches or recognition Robert Caldwell offered. What he needed was the ability to continue doing what he had always done, helping those who needed it most, even if it meant making difficult sacrifices along the way. As he left the mansion, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had made the right choice, and in his heart, he knew that his quiet, steady acts of kindness would have a ripple effect far greater than any fortune could provide. His life had meaning, not because of the accolades or wealth he could have gained, but because of the people he had chosen to protect, no matter the cost. The weight of Mark's decision settled over him like a heavy fog, the silence of the mansion echoing in his mind as he walked away. He had chosen to stay true to his values, to protect Emma and Sarah, but deep down, a sense of regret gnawed at him. The offer he had turned down, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, had promised everything he had ever dreamed of, a life free of the constant struggle. It was the chance to escape his small, modest existence, the chance to make something of himself, to provide a future not just for Sarah and Emma, but for himself as well. Yet despite the sense of pride he felt in upholding his promises, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. The pangs of doubt crept in as he left the luxurious mansion, the vastness of Robert Caldwell's wealth reminding him of the limitations of his own life. The small shop, the late nights of tinkering and fixing things for others. Was it all enough? Had he made the right choice? As he walked back to his shop, Mark reflected on the years he had spent putting others first. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor. His eyes had grown tired, weary from constantly working for a life that seemed just out of reach. He had sacrificed so much, but what had it all amounted to? He had given everything he had, to Emma and Sarah, to the community, to his work, but he had neglected his own dreams, his own future. The regret hit him hardest when he thought about Emma. He had fixed her wheelchair for free, put in long hours, and spent money he didn't have just to make sure she was comfortable. But had he done enough? Had he given her the best possible life he could? Could he have done more if only he had chosen a different path? The thoughts plagued him as he worked late into the night, the quiet hum of machines surrounding him, making the solitude feel even more pronounced. It was in these moments of self-doubt that Mark began to question everything he had worked so hard for. Maybe he was just too afraid to take risks, too afraid to embrace a future that was brighter and more secure. Maybe he was stuck in the past, clinging to old promises he had made without considering the possibility of change, of growth. The next day, as he stood in his shop, Mark was approached by Sarah, Emma's mother. Her smile was warm, but her eyes reflected concern. She had noticed the exhaustion in his face, the weariness in his movements. She had always seen Mark as a rock, the steady force in their lives, but today she could sense something had shifted. "You've been working too hard," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with worry. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know. You've given so much already. Maybe it's time to think about yourself for once." Mark's throat tightened as he looked at Sarah. She was right. He had spent so many years focused on others, focused on fixing what was broken, that he had forgotten to take care of himself. He had pushed his own dreams aside, telling himself it was for the greater good. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the future he wanted, the life he deserved. The weight of his choices began to feel heavier, the regret of letting go of his own aspirations eating at him. "I don't know if I'm enough," Mark admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I've given everything, Sarah. But sometimes, I wonder if it's enough. I wonder if I've missed my chance to have something more, something for myself." Sarah stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've given so much, Mark, but you deserve more too. You've worked your whole life for others, but it's okay to take a step forward, to pursue your own dreams. Emma and I, we need you, but we also want you to be happy." Her words hit him like a revelation. He had been so focused on protecting and helping others that he had forgotten to protect himself. He had been living for others, but now, in this moment, he realized he had to live for himself too. The redemption he sought wasn't just about making up for past mistakes. It was about allowing himself to grow, to find balance, and to take the leap into a future that was brighter, even if it meant accepting help along the way. That evening, Mark sat alone in his shop, the glow of the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. He thought about the offer from Robert Caldwell again. For the first time, he didn't feel resentment. He didn't feel like he had made a mistake. Instead, he felt a sense of clarity, a realization that he hadn't failed. He had just taken a different path, one that wasn't easy, but one that had purpose. But now, he had learned something. Redemption wasn't just about fixing things for others. It was about fixing himself. It was about acknowledging his worth, about believing that he deserved more than the sacrifices he had made. It was about finding a way to balance his responsibilities with his own happiness. The next morning, Mark made a decision. He would accept Robert Caldwell's offer, not because it was the easy way out, but because it was a step towards his own redemption. He would continue helping others, but he would also allow himself to dream again. He would find a way to support Sarah and Emma, but he would also create a future for himself, one where he could thrive, not just survive. Mark knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. He still had doubts, he still had regrets, but he had also learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about using the lessons of the past to shape a better future. As he stood in front of the shop, ready to take the next step, he felt a flicker of hope rise within him. He was on the verge of something bigger than he had ever imagined. The air was crisp as Mark stood in front of the small shop, his gaze drifting over the familiar tools and machinery. It had been his life for so long, the place where he fixed things, where he made a difference in people's lives. But now, standing there, the old sense of satisfaction no longer felt as fulfilling. He had given so much, but there was something missing, a piece of himself that he had neglected for far too long. As Mark wiped his hands on a rag, trying to steady himself before making the phone call to accept the offer from Robert Caldwell, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the decision than just a job. This wasn't just about money or a change of scenery. This was about his own journey of growth and redemption. His phone rang suddenly, breaking through his thoughts. It was Sarah. Her voice, usually calm and warm, was now filled with urgency. "Mark, you need to come to the hospital." "It's Emma. She's in critical condition." Sarah's voice trembled. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach as the words sunk in. What happened?" Mark stammered, his mind racing. "It's the wheelchair. It malfunctioned." Happened to her. But now she was lying there, vulnerable and helpless. And he had no idea if he could keep his promise. "Mark, it's not your fault," Sarah said quietly, as though reading his thoughts. "We didn't know it was going to happen. You did everything you could." But Mark couldn't accept this was it. This was the moment that everything he had worked for, the promises, the sacrifices, the long hours, seemed to be leading up to. The heavy burden of regret weighed on his chest as he looked at Emma, her small, fragile body lying motionless. But in that moment of despair, something shifted within him. A surge of strength coursed through his veins. This wasn't over. Not yet. "I'm not giving up on her," Mark said, his voice firm despite the tears welling in his eyes. "She's a fighter, and I'm going to fight for her too." With renewed determination, Mark decided that he wasn't just Emma to Sarah. No matter where life took him, No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would always fight for the ones he loved. He had always believed that his worth came from what he could give to others, from the sacrifices he made. But now, he understood that his true worth came from his ability to believe in himself, to take chances, and to fight for what he loved. It wasn't just about fixing broken things, it was about healing. Not just others, but himself too. He turned and walked out into the quiet hallway, the weight of the past few days lifting off his shoulders. The offer from Robert Caldwell, an offer that had seemed like a distant dream at one point, now felt like the right step, not just for his career but for his family. He had chosen to accept it, not as an escape, but as a way to build something lasting, something that would allow him to give his family the future they deserved. It was a path that came with risks, challenges, and the uncertainty of a new beginning. But in that uncertainty, Mark found clarity. He remembered the moment Sarah had spoken to him outside the hospital room. Her words echoed in his mind. "You've been so busy taking care of everyone else that you've forgotten about yourself. But it's okay to take a step forward, to dream, to build a life that's better for all of us." Those words had changed something in him. For so long he had been stuck in the cycle of sacrifice, convinced that if he kept giving, everything would eventually fall into place. But he realized that in order to truly be there for Emma, for Sarah, and for himself, he had to allow room for growth, for change. He had to take the leap. As Mark left the hospital that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The offer from Robert Caldwell, which had once felt like a heavy decision, was now a beacon of hope. It wasn't just about wealth or status, it was about creating opportunities for himself and for the people he cared about. Mark knew that he couldn't stay stuck in the same place, constantly trying to fix what was broken without allowing himself the chance to grow. This new chapter would allow him to do more than just repair machines. It would give him the chance to repair his own future, to build something sustainable and lasting. As he drove back to the shop, he thought about Emma's smile when she had first woken up, her eyes bright and full of life once again. He thought about Sarah's encouraging words there for a moment, taking it all in, as though he was savoring the realization that he wasn't the same man who had opened this door all those years ago. He had grown. He had learned to let go of fear, to embrace change, and to take responsibility for his own happiness. Mark knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, sacrifices, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that he was no longer alone in his journey. He had a family who believed in him, and he had learned to believe in himself too. The clarity he had found was not in the absence of struggles, but in the acceptance that life was full of uncertainty. And that was okay. The endless possibilities.